Yeah, there are certain events that take place in our lives that are incredibly profound and impactful. And often these events are incredibly painful. And these life-changing events have a tendency to trigger in us that need to reevaluate where we are. You know, it causes us to pause, shakes us up, and makes us take stock, forces us to reorder maybe certain parts of our lives, to shift our priorities. It's incredibly easy, I think, to put what is relatively unimportant at the center stage, isn't it? And yet, while simultaneously those things that should be at the forefront often get pushed to the margins of our lives. But I guess what it boils down to is what is it that drives you, and what is it that drives me? What is it that actually gets us out of bed in the morning, motivates us? In the passage that was read to us in 2 Corinthians 5, 11 to 15, Paul mentions two things that shaped both his life and his ministry. The first thing he cites is the fear of the Lord. Now, when we think of the fear of the Lord, we mustn't make the mistake of thinking that this fear is the same experience that we might have before a cruel dictator. Rather, it's a reverent fear based on the understanding that one day, and no human being is exempt, we must all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. If we look back in 2 Corinthians, we see this in verse 10. We all stand before the judgment seat of Christ to give an account to the one who judges the world. In other words, how do we invest our time and energy? Did we invest our time and energy into relatively insignificant things? Or did we live our lives for those things that matter most to the Father? It's the gold, silver, costly stone, or wood, hay, and straw in 1 Corinthians, isn't it? But as significant as this is, I want us to focus our attention on the second thing that not only shaped Paul's life and ministry, but to become central to his very being. And it was simply this: the love of Christ. It filled Paul's entire horizon. It informed his every decision. It what drove him to his knees at conversion, and it's what sustained him throughout his life. And so he says in verse 14, "For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all." What Paul could never get over, what Paul could never get past, was that this love of Christ was also for him, included in the all. One of the dangers when we've been on the road for a while as Christians is that we can become over familiar, isn't it? We can become over familiar with Christ's love. We sing it week in, week out. We read umpteen devotions talking about Christ's love for us. And so we actually think we can move on. We may not do it on purpose, but subconsciously we move on. And so we lose what Revelation 2:4 says, our first love. Because for whatever reason, this love of Christ no longer seems to have the same grip on us as it once did, or as it did at the beginning when we first started on our journey with Christ. How crucial it is that we continually return again and again to this unfathomable love of Christ. You see, just as intensely personal it was for the Apostle Paul, so it is for each of us sitting here. Deeply personal, to a level we can't really fully understand this side of eternity. Yeah, as you heard, my family and I were in Burkina Faso for 15 years, and we've now been back in the UK for around about 7 years. And one of the things you do when you've lived out of a country for a period of time, you come back and you become more of an observer. You know, someone coming from a different country into the UK, they're cultural observers for a period of time. And one of the things that we notice when coming back to the UK is that the UK culture has become increasingly moralistic. And when I say moralistic, I don't mean moral. In other words, there has become an increased group sense of what is and what is not acceptable. And this disturbing thing is about this shift in UK culture is that there is an increasing absence of grace. You know, we see this particularly among high-profile people, where what they tweeted X number of years ago is dragged up to the present in order to defame them with no recognition that all of us are prone to make poor judgments, aren't we? There is an absence of forgiveness. And what takes place in society, or as the group, as it kind of is driven to social media, is that we seek to cancel people out, don't we? And I think it was Piers Morgan that coined the phrase of we're living in a cancel culture. You know, it's where if we step out of line or move outside of the acceptable boundaries of contemporary discourse, then boom, cancelled. And I think if we're honest, none of us want to be cancelled, do we? There's a real fear there. When thinking of the love of Christ, you know, one of the most incredible things about Christ's love is that he was willing to be cancelled out so that we don't have to be. And instead of all the weight and the consequences of our sin and our filth and our rebellion falling on our heads, Jesus takes our place. And rather than us being cancelled out, our sin is. As the psalmist says, as far as the east is from the west, so far as he removed our transgressions from us, and so we may be reconciled to the Father as dearly loved children, accepted, forgiven, and now with the objects of Christ's love, personal. Yeah, the second thing I would like us to think about this morning is the scope of God's love. Yeah, one of the things that seems to have become the accepted view is that faith is both personal, but it's also a private matter. In other words, you know, it's fine to believe in Jesus. It's fine to believe whatever you want to believe in, but it is and must be a private matter. Now, the flip side of this coin is that to try to persuade others of what we believe, it's now deemed as unacceptable, or even intolerant in our multicultural, pluralistic society. But of course, when it comes to the Christian faith, yes, it's intensely personal, but it can never be private. The gospel has to be proclaimed. And for the Apostle Paul, it must be for us, it is Christ's love that compels us to proclaim. And why is that? Well, the Apostle Paul answers this question in the very same verse. Christ's love compels us because we are convinced that Christ died for all. And when we use the word all, we must also use the word only. There is no other way. There is no other name. There is no other means of reconciliation to God the Father outside of Christ. And it may not be politically correct, and it may get us labeled intolerant or even cancelled out. But we don't have to look far in the Gospels to hear Jesus' words of, no one comes to the Father except through me. And so the love of Christ is universal in its scope. Here's a question. Do you know what God's overarching purpose is for the whole of creation? Big question. It's this. It's that his glory may fill it. And this happens when men and women and children from every culture, tribe, tongue, and language come to worship him. To put it another way, come to live for him, because that's worship, isn't it? I don't know if you've heard the author John Piper. He's written quite a bit about missions, and in one of his books, it's kind of quite a well-known quote. He says, "Missions is not the ultimate goal of the church. Worship is. Missions exists because worship doesn't." Here's what Habakkuk says as he looks to the future. "For the earth will be filled with the knowledge and the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea." I wouldn't be a very good mission speaker. I'm not quite sure how I'm labeled this morning, but I guess it's been missionaries and I'm a mission speaker. But I guess I wouldn't be a very good mission speaker if I didn't talk about some statistics. I don't know if anyone really enjoys statistics here. I don't meet many people that like statistics, but sometimes statistics can be helpful. Here's a few. In the entirety of the world's population, there's approximately 17,400 unique people groups, each with their own language, their own way of doing things, their own worldview. Of these 17,400 unique people groups, there are 7,398, approximately, that's quite precise, isn't it? of these groups that are still classified as unreached with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's 42% of the world's population. They're still yet to have a viable witness living amongst them. The gospel message. Or put it another way, world's population. What's the world's population approximately? Any ideas? About 7.8 billion, I think it is, and it will be going up all the time. 3.2 billion of the world's population is still unreached with the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's 41%. The task is enormous. It's actually kind of quite staggering. But here's the thing, and something we must take on board. And it's abundantly clear, both from who God is and what he says in his word, that he will get the task done. He's not going to fail. He's not going to fail, that the earth will be filled with his glory. It will happen. And as I think of the church coming back to the UK in the West, and often you don't hear missions talked about that often, if I'm honest. And the question is for us, does the church in the UK, in Dunchurch, in Rugby, want to be part of what God is doing throughout the world? That's why as a church, we're a mission-minded church in Rugby, in the UK, in the West. If we want to continue to engage in what God is doing around the world. And so Christ's love is personal. Christ's love is universal. And finally, Christ's love is costly. Now, I don't know if it's my age, and it might be, or it might be just me. This is being a little bit grumpy. I'm an absolute joy to live with. But there are some phrases and terms that are bantered around in the 21st century that get right up my nose. I don't know if that could resonate with anyone. And one of the phrases that really annoys me is when somebody wants to agree with somebody and says, oh yeah, 100%. I mean, I'm sorry if you use that phrase, but it just kind of annoys me. Or if you really want to emphasize or exaggerate something, oh yeah, 110%, I agree. But there we go. It more than likely is me. And maybe some of the people who are laughing are thinking, yeah, I get that. Another term that I kind of find kind of frustrating used in certain contexts is the term love is love. It's a kind of pointless term that actually says very little as to what love actually is. At best, it's an acknowledgement to the presence of an emotion. But it fails to give us a blueprint as to what love actually looks like. But when the Bible talks of God being love, we only have to look to the cross to understand how costly love is in its ultimate expression. You know, one of the commentators on 2 Corinthians phrases it beautifully. And he says, from a biblical perspective, love has less to do with romantic feelings, but everything to do with sacrificial care. Just think about that for a moment. A description of love, sacrificial care. Imagine how marriages would be transformed with that motif of love, of sacrificial care. Imagine what our communities would look like with that motif of sacrificial care. And so when Paul states Christ's love compels us, this wasn't Paul being driven along on a tide of emotion. No, he understood fully the shape and direction his ministry would take, and he accepted that as he engaged in the glorious purposes of God. It was going to be costly. Yeah, sadly, our society has been sold the American dream, where the chief aim of the individual seems just to be happy. And so happiness becomes what drives us. And my question would be, if this is our chief aim, then why are so many people in the West so unhappy? Yeah, that probably sounds like a right miserable so-and-so. I'm not, because I believe that Christians should be some of the most happy, joyous people on the face of the planet. But joy and happiness should not be our aim, should not be our goal. Rather, the Lord and serving Him should be our aim and our goal, and joy and happiness is the byproduct of that. And if happiness becomes our main drive, then we will always limit this compelling love of Christ that Paul talks about to how I feel. Yeah, I have the absolute privilege of working and walking alongside some wonderful individuals and families, all with a heart to serve the Lord in different and often difficult parts of the world. I hesitate to use the word amazing, although I could be justified in using that word to describe them, but I think it's more helpful for us to describe them as just ordinary men and women, just like you and me, who have been transformed by this amazing love of Christ. Most, if not all, serving in some very difficult contexts around the world. But I want to kind of close by talking about one lady I met last October when I was visiting Burkina. Her name is Amy. And Amy had such a smile. She had such an incredible joy with her presence, and she was an absolute delight to spend time with. And I can't recall when her and her husband arrived in Burkina, but they helped set up an orphanage in the west of the country where they poured their lives into children who otherwise would have been left on the scrap heap. Life is harsh in Burkina, certainly amongst those who have disabilities, and that's where most of the people with disabilities find themselves, in orphanages. The tangibility of Christ's love unmistakable. Well, on the 5th of February 2016, a few years back now, everything changed for Amy. Her husband had driven to the capital to pick up friends from the airport. And whilst waiting for the flight to come in, he went to a nearby cafe with a pastor. At a similar time, jihadists entered and just started shooting. It wasn't long before Amy found out that her husband would not be coming home. He was killed. And so she went back to the States to receive counseling and help. And it was assumed by friends and church members that she wouldn't be heading back out to Burkina Faso after such a tragedy. And then this was a kind of story that was referred to by a friend of mine in the response that she gave. So the children in this orphanage, they've already lost a father. Why in the world would I want them to lose a mother as well? And so Amy returned to Burkina Faso to serve the poorest and most vulnerable. Why? Because Christ's love compelled her. Let me just finish with these words of 2 Corinthians 5:14-15, which generally sums it up. For Christ's love compels us, because we are convinced that one died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again.